In line with our last chapter, raise your words, not your voice. It is rain that grows flowers, not thunder. That's from Rumi, ancient poet. So in this chapter 16, we will discuss how to construct an argument, and there are various ways to approach argumentation. So firstly, we'll look at what is an argument. Secondly, we will cover different fallacies or errors that are used in reasoning. And finally, we'll take a look at some different organizational patterns that can be used in persuasion. So looking at an argument, there's a very basic structure. In the last slideshow, we looked at the use of rhetorical proofs. That's ethos, logos, and pathos. You need the rhetorical triangle to construct your appeals. And in addition to that, you need to construct an argument to be persuasive. So you have to have a claim, you need to have evidence to support the claim, and then you need the warrant, and that is the reasoning that ties the claim and the evidence together. So why should we bother studying this? Why should we bother studying argumentation? Number one, the effects on your audience. There's an inner sense of reasoning that we all have. When you make a rational argument, many people are much more open to hearing what you have to say, to hearing what your claim is, what your evidence is, what your reasoning is. So it's really important to understand that when you can construct a solid argument, it does have a positive impact, or has at least the potential for a positive impact on your audience. It helps to control the emotions so that you're not just focused on emotional appeals. Although they are part of an appeal, you have to make sure that you're not just solely focusing on emotions. And that's where some of the fallacies come in, the errors in reasoning that we'll talk about a little bit later, because they really work to evoke specific emotions within an audience, but they're based in errors in reasoning. They are completely illogical. And also to just improve your persuasive ability. When you understand argumentation, number one, you're going to understand how to use it to get what you want, and also how it's being used on you when others are trying to get what they want from you. So it's a really good skill set to learn, kind of a science or art, if you will, to learn to understand A, self, and B. And now moving on to understanding informal logic. So that's how we argue with each other every day, or everyday arguments. And when we make these arguments, we don't always have our evidence to support our claim, or the warrant that's fully stated to justify the claim and how it connects to the evidence. It's typically just how we argue every day. And Aristotle coined the term enthymeme, and that is how he thinks we as speakers should argue, make our arguments, construct our arguments with everyday people. Because he said, the people that use syllogisms are philosophers, where they have a major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. And regular people, they just want to make their own conclusion based on their own premise. And so you kind of lead them to the conclusion that you want them to make without stating it directly. So in the next slide, so there are two main types of reasoning that we're covering in class right now, deductive and inductive. So a deductive reasoning is reasoning from a very general premise to a much more specific conclusion. An example of deductive reasoning would be a syllogism, and we'll take a look at that in just a minute. And then inductive reasoning is when you're reasoning from a very specific premise to a more general conclusion. So an example of inductive reasoning would be, let's say Professor Smith, okay? You should take your introductory math class from Professor Smith because they're very friendly and they explain things well. So that's based on your personal experience. So you're making, based on your specific personal experience, that they're friendly and they explain things well, the more general conclusion, the more general argument that they should take class with Professor Smith. So that's based on your personal observation, your personal experience. That's more inductive. So it's from your specific to general, you're making the more general conclusion. Now, a syllogism is a form of deductive reasoning, and the most common syllogism that you will see in any philosophy class or class in logic or class in rhetoric and communication. Major premise, all men are mortal. So that's the major premise. Minor premise, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. So based on this major premise, this very specific premise, I am making the more general conclusion that Socrates is mortal. So going back, oh, I can't go back. Okay. So moving forward, so how does a syllogism differ from everyday arguments? Well, remember that the syllogism, every premise is going to be stated. You're going to have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. However, in everyday arguments, oftentimes the premise is not stated. So an example of that would be Socrates died because he's mortal. So we don't have to say that all men are mortal, but we can still make the conclusion that he died because he was mortal. We can also make the conclusion that Socrates passed away because he was a man. We can make the conclusion that Socrates passed away because he was human. So we don't have to state every specific premise. So how do syllogisms relate to public speaking? Well, you want to omit, you don't want to speak in a syllogistic fashion with a real live human audience, but when you are constructing your argument, you might want to just write down a syllogism, like make these little mini arguments with your speech topic and create your own mini syllogisms so that you can put that into common language and that you can take those syllogisms and create a claim that has the evidence, that has the warrant that ties the claim and the evidence together. So remember that in persuasion, you want to omit some of the premises. You don't want to say, this is my major premise, this is my minor premise. So you want to omit some of the premises because you want your audience to fill in the unstated part. If the audience, without you having to tell them that they need to do this or they must do this, they're more likely to fill in that unstated part, and then the opportunity for you to persuade them is far greater. The reason people are persuaded by a speaker is because they participate in the creation of arguments with the speaker. So no one wants to be told, you must do this, and if you don't do it, X is going to happen. People want to be able to participate in the creation of arguments with you as a speaker. So the contemporary approach to argument is you have a claim, you have evidence, and then you tie the claim and the evidence together with a warrant. So what does that look like? Well, you can make 3 different types of claims for your final speech. Could be a claim of fact, this is true or false. Could be a claim of value, this is good or bad. Or it could be a claim of policy, advocating for or against a specific type of policy. So you want to make some sort of claim, either fact, value, or policy. So when you're thinking about your final speech topic, ask yourself, okay, am I making a claim of fact that I'm arguing this is true or false? Am I making a claim of value that this is good or bad? Or policy that this is something we should adopt or not? So some of the examples of what that actually looks like here, different types of claims can emerge. So here we have a value. If you ever hear yourself say, you should or shouldn't. So I should not have eaten that foot-long submarine sandwich because it made me sick. I should not have. You are attaching a value that it was a really bad idea to eat that entire sub. That's a value. It's either you should or you shouldn't do something. That's a claim of value. Now, if you make the claim of fact, eating that foot-long submarine sandwich made me sick. That's a claim of fact. Now you can argue, well, is that what really made you sick? So that is, you're saying it's true that eating it actually made you sick, or you might argue that it's false, that it didn't make you sick. So that's a claim of fact, advocating that something is true or false. And then finally, you could make an argument. You could look at the same type of claim and then turn it into a policy argument. And that is that Stormy Cloud subs should not sell sandwiches that large. That's a policy claim. So you're advocating a specific policy that they should stop selling sub sandwiches that are that large. So when you are constructing your final argument, ask yourself, are you making a claim of fact, true or false, value, good or bad, or policy, right or wrong? Now, even though your textbook says that when your claims need to be related to speaking goals, when you're speaking to inform, we have more claims of fact. However, I'm going to allow you some leeway here that you can still make an argument, though, with a claim of fact. You can make an argument with a claim of value, and you can make an argument with a claim of policy. So I'm going to give you some leeway. If you choose to make a claim of fact, that's fine. Claim of value, that's fine. Claim of policy, that's fine. Just know that commonly when we make claims of fact, it's to inform. Commonly when we make claims of value, it's to celebrate. And commonly when we make claims of policy, it's to persuade. However, it's not really that black and white. So if you've learned anything in this class, you understand that rhetoric is not really completely black and white. So you have your claim, and now you need evidence. And evidence, it's your support for the actual claim. And the type that you actually use depends on what your speech goal is going to be. Do you want to change a policy? Do you want to get people to boycott a specific restaurant? Do you want people to make better decisions? So the type of evidence that you use to support your claim will really depend upon the goal of your actual speech. And then finally, the reasoning, that's the warrant. The reasoning is the most important part of your argument because it links the claim and the evidence. And oftentimes it's the unstated part of your argument, but not always. So sometimes you can make the reasoning, the warrant, the connection between the claim and the evidence. You can also state that in your speech. Some common mistakes that we make with warrants is, for you as a listener, sometimes we assume that there's only one reason why X is true, and that could be a fallacy, that's an error in reasoning, and that there's only one correct warrant when oftentimes there might be many. And then for you as a speaker, when you're the one writing the speech, you have to understand that sometimes you create unintended warrants with familiar audiences. So you really want to know your audience and what type of reasoning, what type of justification is going to work with that particular type of audience. So it's really important that you understand who you're talking to. Now, moving on to some of the errors that we make in argumentation, and they're really common, and that's why I'm going to teach you about some of them, but there are many, many others. And fallacies are errors in reasoning, errors in inductive and deductive reasoning. They can be deliberate, or you can make a mistake and not realize that you are using a fallacy. And if you look in your persuasive speech evaluation form, you will notice that your speech has to be free from fallacies. You will be marked off. Your argument will not be as strong if you incorporate fallacies into your speech. And fallacies are often used with emotional topics, so you do want to stay away from a fallacy. So there's different types of fallacies that are based on appeals to feelings. The first one is ad hominem, and that is when you are attacking a person's character unfairly. And what you're really doing is you're trying to divert attention from the issue and get people to focus on this person's character. So it's very common. You just have to turn on the news and you'll see tons of ad hominems, any channel. It doesn't matter if it's MSNBC or if it's Fox. You'll see personal attacks all the time, and that is just not logical. It is a complete fallacy. So you want to stay away from ad hominems. The next one is ad baculum, and that's the fear-based appeal, and that's when there's some type of threat of force or violence. So, for example, think of a bully who's trying to at a school, someone's trying to bully you, and you're in high school and they're trying to bully you, and they said, you're either going to do this or I'm going to beat you up. And you're like, okay, you'll comply. I'll do it because I don't want to be beaten up. So that's ad baculum. That's a fallacy, and it's when you use a fear-based appeal or you threaten force or violence with a group of people. And this too is used, fear-based appeals, all the time in politics. So either you do this or else you're going to experience a great strife in your life, and oftentimes that is not accurate. Another type of appeal fallacy is ad misericordiam. And when you're appealing to the misfortune of others, you're really trying to speak or to evoke sympathy from your audience, and you want them to feel really badly. And if an audience feels guilty or they feel really badly about something, they are much less likely to think logically, and they might be more persuaded because you've just played on their guilt or their pity or their sympathy. The next one is ad populum, and you're appealing to the popular feelings. And just because, everyone thinks it's a really good idea, but there's no evidence to support it, that's what's popular, that, okay, I think then too it's a good idea. So you're not using evidence, you're not using reasoning, but just because everyone thinks that this is the right thing to do, the right thing to believe, then you also will say, well, yeah, it's popular, so it must be the right thing. And again, that's oftentimes a fallacy. And then it's very similar to the bandwagon fallacy as well. Hell, everyone's doing it, so I may as well too. So since everyone is jumping off the bridge, I'm going to jump off it too. So that's the bandwagon fallacy, and oftentimes that can lead to problems. Another fallacy is the either or fallacy, and it's also called the fallacy of, it's very much related to the false dilemma. And it's when someone is making the argument that either you do this or that. You're with me or you're against me. And anyone who's ever said something like that, that is a complete fallacy. That's an either or fallacy. There is usually always more than just two choices. So that's a fallacy. You want to try to stay away from that type of fallacy as well. And then the non sequitur. That's when the conclusion does not follow. So if you watch a commercial or you look at some type of political cartoon, and oftentimes they're non sequiturs because it apps your thinking. The conclusion does not logically flow. It absolutely makes no sense. Couple more, we have the red herring, and these are fallacies that attempt to short circuit our reasoning. And in the red herring, it will misdirect our attention, so it's not relevant to the issue at hand. So if, let's say, a politician is being asked a pointed question and they refuse to answer it, but they say, well, I didn't do this. However, this is what I did do. And then they go on talking about something that completely has nothing to do with the question that was asked. And that's a red herring. That's very common in politics when people don't want to answer the question. And then there's the slippery slope, and that's when the argument that argues that something bad will inevitably happen. So this will cause this, and then we know it's all doomed from there. So that's a slippery type slope. And then another fallacy that attempts to short circuit our reasoning is the straw man, and that's an oversimplification of another's argument, a claim that your opponent argued something that she or he didn't argue, and you're trying to set yourself up so you can sound like you're making a really strong argument when in fact it's really just a straw man. So I want you to look at this, and I want you to try to guess what fallacy this is. So you have two individuals there, and the one individual says, last night I used my first argumentum ad baculum. This guy backed off when I made an implicit threat. And the woman says, yes, many people respond to fear and threats rather than logic. You don't have to have valid arguments to manipulate people's emotions. And she says, this power really controls people. It's great. So yes, it already gave it away. That is ad baculum. Appeals that we make to threat, fear-based appeals. And it's really important that you as a speaker avoid this. And two, that you see the fear-based appeals when they're being used on you, because it's just a way for speakers to manipulate you. So you really want to make sure that you do your best to see through that. Okay, what type of fallacy do you think this is? You've got these sheep, and the one sheep says, looks like one of us. And the other sheep says, a sheep for sure. The other sheep says, see, everyone agrees he's one of us. And then the other sheep says, wolf. So which one do you think that is? And if you guessed ad populum, you are correct. because it is what is popular. Since everyone says it, because that's the popular thing, then we make the assumption. And finally, this is another fallacy. Which one do you think it is? USA, love it or leave it. Okay, if you guessed either or fallacy, you are correct, because there are more than two options. If you value the USA, you don't have to love it or leave it, but you can stay here and make it better. So remember that whenever you hear an either this or that, oftentimes that is a fallacy, that is illogical, and there are other options, there are other possibilities. So keep that in mind with fallacies. You really want to stay away from them. You want to know and understand all the different types of fallacies, especially when they are being used against you. Now moving on to the final segment of the slideshow. I know this was a really long slideshow, but this is the final chapter of the semester. And organizational patterns. You could still use topical / categorical for your persuasive speech, but you also might think about using some other patterns that really fit the goal of your speech. So one type of pattern is called the Monroe's Motivated Sequence, and it's broken down into 5 general parts that I'll talk about in a minute. But if you look over here to the left, you'll see Richard Simmons. And the reason why I've included him is because oftentimes, for those of you who don't know, he's like a health guru. You can Google his YouTube videos. He's pretty funny. So he's a health, fitness, wellness type of guru from the 80s. And I think he's still working today and trying to persuade people to live a healthier lifestyle. But he oftentimes used infomercials that were organized according to Monroe's Motivated Sequence. And the reason why you would use this type of organizational pattern for your speech is if you wanted to motivate your audience to change their behavior, you want to motivate them to action. This is a really excellent way to organize your speech. So let's say he's trying to persuade you all to purchase his old-time video, Sweating to the Oldies. And what he'll do is he will typically gain his audience's attention the very first part of the sequence, and he'll come out and he'll do something zany and crazy, and he'll connect with the audience members. And then he goes on to the second step, and that's to identify the need or the problem. And he'll identify the problem in the United States. We are the most overweight industrialized nation in the world. We are very unhealthy as a culture, as a nation, and that's a huge problem. And then he'll move on to the third step, and that's to satisfy the need or the problem. And one way to satisfy the problem that we have of not being healthy in this country is to purchase Sweating to the Oldies. And so he'll talk about Sweating to the Oldies. And the fourth step is to visualize it. So he will talk about his own experience, and then he'll bring on people that have actually used the program, used the video before, and how they went from being unhealthy to healthy. He'll have interviews, so he will visualize for the audience what their life can be like too. And then finally, the last step in the sequence is to call people to action. So the final action is to ask the audience to be responsible for their health, take the initiative, and purchase Sweating to the Oldies in 3 low installments of $19.99 per month for 3 months. So that's a call to action. So that's an example of an organizational pattern that you would use if your goal is to change behavior or to get your audience to act on something. Another organizational pattern that's pretty common for a persuasive speech is a problem solution. So you'd still have your intro, you'd still have your conclusion, but the body of your speech would be main point 1, problem, main point 2, solution. So main point 1, you're defining the problem, explaining it, reasoning out why it's a problem, how it relates to the audience. And then main point 2 is your solution to the problem. You reason it out, you offer the evidence, and that's one pretty widely used organizational pattern for a persuasive speech. Another pattern that is used is persuading with refutation. It's called the refutational pattern. And think of it like this. I call it the inoculation effect. It's when you inoculate against possible counter arguments. So you describe the opposing position, describe the consequences, state your position, and contrast the consequences of your position with your opponent's. And if you've ever watched a debate, a presidential debate, or any type of debate for that matter, oftentimes they will use persuasion with refutation. So an example of that would be, my opponents say this about me, but that is not true. And this is what is detrimental to what they're saying. This is what I actually do. And then you would note the differences between what is being said and then what is actually true. So you're inoculating against the possible counter arguments. Another example of that might be more relatable is if someone were to make the argument persuading the audience to get vaccinated. So you have the vaccinators and the anti-vaccinators. And so let's say you're trying to persuade the audience to get vaccinated. You might choose, if you have a hostile audience, this works best with a hostile audience, people that are critical of your claim. What you might do is say, okay, some people make the argument that vaccines are dangerous, but the evidence demonstrates this. They're not. And then you reason it all out. You provide the evidence, you reason it out. That's called the inoculation effect, and that's persuading with refutation. And then there's persuading with comparative advantage. So that's when in the body of your speech you state the problem and or the need for change. You describe your solution, second main point. And the third main point is you explain why your solution is better than all the rest. So that's persuading with comparative advantage. So we covered a lot in the slideshow. We covered what an argument is, the different fallacies, and how to organize your persuasive. So I leave you with a quote from Kenneth Burke, father of modern rhetoric. Wherever there is persuasion, there is rhetoric, and wherever there is rhetoric, there is meaning. Remember, meanings are in people.